turn into a quest for revenge.
Well, now, the arrival of Tony Blair in today's election has put Britain's place in the world at the very heart of the election campaign. So to discuss that, Europe and the fallout of our Middle Eastern foreign policy, are the Conservative Chief Whip, Michael Gove, and Labour's Foreign Affairs spokesman, Gareth Thomas. And I'm wondering whether, given that you wrote a book in the aftermath of 7/7, which talked very much about radicalisation and extremism, I'm wondering whether any of your colleagues in the Cabinet read it, because one might argue that in the course of the last 5 years, radicalisation has simply zoomed.
I know that a number of my colleagues have read it, but far more importantly, they've read the intelligence and security briefings, which have emphasised exactly what you say, John, and what we've seen on our screens.
But their policy in response has been a failure.
I don't believe that, no. Because I think Theresa May's been, I think, the most energetic and effective Home Secretary when it's come to dealing with extremism and terrorism that we've had. And that's not to take anything away from the honesty...
Well, until the chief of her prison service jumps up and now retired and says, frankly, the prison cuts have resulted in rampant radicalisation in jails.
I would utterly reject that. I don't think there's any connection between the savings that have been made in the Justice Department, not Theresa's department, but still an important one, and radicalisation. The problem that arises from radicalisation is one that springs from a particular ideology, which we have been clear needs to be countered at every level. The big shift between the last government and this is that the last government didn't make the connection between non-violent extremism, which is the sort of seedbed of what subsequently becomes jihadism. It only concentrated on violent extremism. Basically, it didn't drain the swamp. It only waited until the alligators were just there by the side of the boat.
Right. Well, now, I could put to you, let's dig up sores. I've tried to dig one up with his book, but there it is, I failed. But I'm going to dig up Tony Blair, who's dug himself up today and appeared in his old constituency, much to the embarrassment, it seems, of the Labour leadership. No embarrassment at all.
I don't think that's true.
No.
Actually, I think the speech he made on Europe was bang on the money. I think he was right to highlight that...
well, why wasn't anybody there? You weren't there, nobody was there.
Well, I was campaigning hard in my own constituency.
One would.
And others would do...
Well, what about the war he led us all into and for which Michael and you both voted? Iraq, now seen very much to be the father and mother of ISIS.
I don't think that's the case at all, actually. If you look at some of the reasons for the rise of extremism, we see, for example, Al-Qaeda...
So the war on Iraq was a good thing.
Well, just let me finish.
Was it a good thing?
Let me just finish.
You're glad you voted for it?
Let me just finish making the point. I am glad that we don't have Saddam Hussein any longer at all. That's absolutely...
At the cost of what's happened since?
Well, the wider point I was going to make was that actually extremism has been a feature of the Middle East for far longer than the Iraq conflict. We saw, for example, the bombings of the US embassies by Al-Qaeda in Africa in the 1990s. So where I think I do agree with Michael is that the effort to fight extremism is certainly not one by any stretch of the imagination.
Are you proud of what we did in terms of going to war in Iraq? Are you proud of your vote? Was it the right thing to do?
With hindsight, I think there were a number of mistakes made, but at the time, I believed that it was the right thing to do, and I think it would be wrong now to resile from the choice that I made at the time.
Well, let's deal with the now. What is Britain's policy? Britain seems to have withdrawn from the world. I mean, it's nowhere in Ukraine, it's nowhere, it seems, in the Middle East, doing nothing about Syria.
I don't think that's right at all, actually. There are British forces who are engaged in helping to, first of all, contain and then roll back ISIS at the moment. There are British forces in Kurdistan helping to train the Kurdish fighters, the Peshmerga. And I think Britain is the country that flies the second highest number of sorties in order to support the Iraqi government in dealing with ISIS on the ground. So we're absolutely committed in this fight because the threat that ISIS poses is not just a threat to the Iraqi government, it is a threat, as we heard in that earlier package, to all of us. There is a direct link between the terrorist activity that we have to combat in Iraq and the radicalisation of people who wish us harm here, as we saw, for example, in France with the Charlie Hebdo killings.
On your watch, the worst humanitarian disaster since the Second World War, quotes United Nations, has occurred in Syria, about which we have done nothing.
Well, I don't think that you can tax this government with turning the other way when it comes to Syria. We sought authorization in the House of Commons in order to intervene to deal with Bashar Assad's breach of international law and his use of chemical weapons.
But do you accept that your original vote
voted against it?
Do you accept that your original vote to go to war in Iraq neutralised your capacity to do anything at all about Syria?
Absolutely not, because I think that it's only by dealing with those people, Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, start, who break international law, who wage war on their own people and their neighbours, that you can uphold the international order. Your first premise was that we were disengaged in the world. We are engaged in the world with our allies.
Where were we in Ukraine?
Well,
not there, not to be seen, not even to be heard. France and, Germany.
No, I think again, that's an example of...
fine European cooperation from which you'd like to withdraw.
No, I think that's an example of a mistake, because actually we've been the strongest voice arguing for sanctions against Putin for what he's done, and we have, both on the European stage and elsewhere, consistently argued that Putin's invasion of a sovereign nation, of the Ukraine, cannot go unpunished.
Well, the most senior figure for Britain in NATO has described Britain as an increasing irrelevance on the world stage. So that is a damning indictment from someone who, at the very heart of international affairs. Well, first of all, I think we should be proud of our place in Europe. We should be pushing for reform, but we should be clear, as Tony Blair said, as Tony Blair said today, and as Ed Miliband has said before, we need to stay an active part in Europe. It matters for British jobs, it matters for British business, and it matters for our place on the world stage and whether or not we can have influence in world affairs.
But you would deny people a choice on whatever reforms are produced in Europe?
We're very clear we should stay in Europe. If there's a proposal for a further significant transfer of powers, then yes, we think there should be a referendum at that point. But we're certainly not proposing a significant transfer of powers. We're not aware that any other major country is pushing that either.
Well, a man today that we've already mentioned, for whom you had a little bit of regard, I think, at some point, Tony Blair, has said that it is, in fact, producing unpredictability for the British economy, that the referendum is an extremely dangerous operation.
Well, you put the point very well yourself, John, when you asked Gareth about it, that Tony Blair wants to deny, and Ed Miliband absolutely agrees that the British public should be denied, any say over our future in Europe. And I think that we need...
But I thought you were a deep-old constitutionalist who believed in parliamentary democracy. What's referenda doing anyway? Don't you elect MPs to decide these things?
It's because I believe in parliamentary democracy that I want to see a shift of power from the European Union, which is less accountable, to Westminster, which is more accountable.
Michael.
And I want to make sure that people in this country have a chance to have the relationship that they always wanted in Europe, but not run by it.
Michael knows full well that the only reason that David Cameron is proposing a referendum is out of weakness. He's been forced to this position. He hasn't chosen to go down this route himself. He said back in 2010 that he didn't want a referendum.
We're going to have to stop it there, but thank you very much indeed, Gareth Thomas and Michael Gove. I'm very grateful to you for coming in. Cathy.
Thanks, John. A former boss of G4